This is American Government, Wednesday, August 19th, 2020. Um, you should have your notes in front of you that I passed out on Tuesday evening, and I explained in the email note that you should um, print them out. And if you want to print them out in triple space, that would be better. I give my lectures in outline form because I don't like PowerPoint. I think it creates short attention span. And I like you to see where I'm going with the outline. But again, as I mentioned in the email, taking notes is actually a very difficult skill. It's real multitasking. So if you want, you can print out the Word version and then triple space it to leave even more space. Um, for Friday, by the way, please read and prepare the Declaration of Independence, and both the Wilson text and the Nichols reader have the Declaration. But I think the best thing to do is to print out the version that I emailed out to you. It's divided into paragraphs and it's easier to follow, and you'll see an outline. The other thing is Wilson Chapter 2. Now, Wilson Chapter 2 is generally speaking the chapter on the founding, and that includes both the Revolution, the events leading up to the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution. We're going to be sort of using that as background for the next several lectures. And for Friday, just the first couple of pages that cover up to the Revolution. On Friday, I'm going to give a historical background of the Declaration. And then over the next couple of lectures, we're going to spend a good deal of time intensively analyzing the Declaration. And the way I set this up is to sort of imagine from the outside, as to say the historical circumstances that lead to the Declaration, and I'll give some of the history of that led up to the Revolution. And then we'll look at the overall structure of the Declaration. It's a tightly organized document. It's an argument, not argument in the kind that husbands and wives have. You didn't take out the garbage. Yes, I did. No, you didn't, and so forth. An argument is actually a form of structured, rational persuasion. There are different kinds of argument. You may be familiar with a syllogism, where you have a major premise A, a minor premise B, and a conclusion C. Socrates is a man is the major premise. Uh, no, I'm sorry, I screwed it up. All men are mortal. That's the major premise. Socrates is a man, a minor premise. C, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. The spoof of that is the conclusion is that all men are Socrates, and if only that were the case. Um, but at any rate, and I'll mail out in addition to the notes beforehand, as I did last night or tonight. I'll send out a blank copy of the Declaration's outline, and I'll go over that in class, and then if you can do that beforehand, that would be a good exercise. For this lecture, by the way, I'd like you to not only send me an email that you watched it, but then start from this lecture sending a brief summary. So if you have the notes in front of you, what I want to do is I want to talk about political science and politics, and talk about a few things in the first chapter of the Wilson Reader. Some cute things there that I want to discuss. And in terms of talking about politics, political science, I want to again, I might have mentioned this in my first lecture, tell you a little bit about myself. I went to school at Northern Illinois University as an undergraduate. I'm from Illinois originally, and like many of you are and will be doing, I went through all kinds of possible majors before I settled on political science. I thought, well, I'd become a lawyer, but then my junior year, I took some courses in political theory and fell in love with political science. And some voice in me said, that's what I want to be for the rest of my life. And so here we are. I got my BA and MA from Northern Illinois University, and then I got my PhD from the University of Virginia. And my primary areas are political philosophy, ancient and modern, American politics and political institutions, constitutional law, American political thought, and at UVA at that time you had to have a fifth area, so I did an international relations theory. But I Never really taught a course in that, and I wouldn't claim expertise in that. Um, Wilson in chapter 1, and this is from the latest edition, has a kind of a cute statement. This is on page, by the way, 13. And let me use this statement to introduce political science and myself. He says in the first column of page 13, ideally, political scientists ought to be able to give clear answers, amply supported by evidence, uh, to the questions we have posed about American democracy, starting with who governs. In reality, they can at best give partial, contingent, and controversial answers. The reason is to be found in the nature of our subject. Unlike economists who assume that people have more or less stable preferences and can compare ways of satisfying those preferences by looking at the relative prices of various goods and services, political scientists are interested in how preferences are formed, especially for those kinds of services such as national defense or pollution control that cannot be evaluated chiefly in terms of monetary costs. It almost sounds as if what Wilson is saying is that economics is neat and straightforward, and political science, politics, is messy. Well, it certainly is. And it may be that political science is messier than economics. Hard to say. Um, Now, again, my essential approach to political science is, as I said, is political philosophy, political theory, and political institutions. Political science, or the politics, as some universities and colleges call their government department, or for instance, at UVA was the government department, at NIU was the Department of Political Science. Congress can't afford its own political science or politics department, so we're a hybrid with the history department. Um, But you should know, of course, that like any other discipline, there are controversies within political science as to how to study the subject of politics. I'm going to make an analogy later to the science of psychology, and if you major in psych or have taken psych classes, you know that psychology is a discipline. You can call everyone a psychologist or study psychology, but they're actually very different approaches as to what human behavior and consciousness is and how to study it. And you'll see in some ways political science is like that, and I have a certain orientation within that. Um, what I'm going to do, if you're looking at the outline, I want to again, after having, the other thing I wanted to say is the way I teach this class. Many professors use their classrooms, and I think I mentioned this in the first lecture, but I do want to reiterate it. Um, uh, Many professors use their classrooms as a platform or a soapbox for their ideologies or partisan preferences. I'm an American citizen. I was raised in this country. I have partisan. I have a partisan identity. Um, but I don't particularly see my role in this class as impressing or enforcing my political partisan identity on you. Um, the proper function of a teacher is to help his students to learn and think, especially within his expertise or her expertise and discipline. Um, Again, insofar as my uh, let me explain. I think the biases on this subject that do come in and probably do determine how I teach this material and lay it out in front of you. Um, I've been studying American institutions, constitutional law in particular, and the presidency was my dissertation topic all my life. And I do have a fundamental opinion about the nature of American politics and the American constitutional order. I generally approve of it. I think that the founding of the country, especially the remarkable construction of the Constitution by the framers, was one of the most remarkable acts of statesmanship in human history. Um, it took an English prime minister, William Gladstone, one of the two great Jewish prime ministers of England in the 19th century, um, Gladstone and Disraeli. Gladstone said of the American Constitution that it was the greatest work of the mind of man in a single time and place, ever struck off in a single time and place, which is high praise about the American Constitution from a foreigner. Um, I share that opinion. Um, my patriotism doesn't necessarily bleed over into my courses, but having studied the American founding all my life and the development of the American political order, I am a partisan of it. Now, having said that, that does not mean that I think America is a perfect nation, that I think the Constitution is perfect in all of its aspects. The framers were remarkable statesmen and designed a remarkable political order that has seen remarkable crises and tensions and survived a civil war, depression, several major world wars, and still stands to be improved. Um, but by and large, when it comes to uh, particular partisan issues in contemporary politics, I try to remain neutral to those, or at least see my role as laying out both sides without taking a side myself. That's how I try to present this class. Now, uh, let's go back to the kind of talking about political science and how it bears on this class. Um, the word politics as political science, of course, or the words, all our words in English, politics, political, politician, um, polity, actually, a word I'll come back to later, all derived from the Greek word, the core Greek word polis, which is the Greek word for city, as in Indianapolis. But the Greeks meant by polis not a city like Spartanburg or Greenville, but rather they understood by the term polis what we would call a country or a nation, like Canada or America. That is to say, the polis is a collection of human beings uh, that govern authoritatively um, uh, many, if not all, aspects of their lives. Some political communities try to govern all aspects of human life. We tend to call those totalitarian. I'm not referring necessarily to the political regimes of the 20th century, uh, but but um, but human beings that live in a polis uh, um, ascribe sovereignty to that community. Now we'll see that human beings belong to all kinds of communities. You're a member of a family, you're a member of a church, you're a member of Converse College, um, and yet, as Aristotle suggested, the polis is the sovereign human community. What the word sovereign means is the highest authority. Uh, that is to say, beyond the political community that you live in, there is no higher authority. Now, we'll talk about this later too. We moderns living today, we have a tendency to say, well, what about the United Nations? The United Nations is not a sovereign body. It is composed, it's an organization, a confederation, strictly speaking, of sovereign units. And the measure of that, by the way, is if one of those sovereign units wishes to pull out of the United Nations, it can do so. Now, we'll see that one of the great controversies within American politics is whether the states, like Virginia or South Carolina or North Carolina, are sovereign units. You'll see that at the founding of the country, there was a shift in the understanding of the sovereignty of our states. And this is a controversy that goes deeply within our politics and still, some ways is still worked out today. The Civil War, by the way, you could say, settled that question brutally, and we'll come back to that. So the polis is really what today we would call a country or a nation. And it is exercises the highest authority. Now you can say, well, but wait a minute, the highest part of my identity is my church. Say, if you're a Methodist or a Baptist or a Presbyterian or a Jew. But in reality, if you think about it, um, for instance, the political authority of the United States determines what certain religious groups can and can't do. For instance, certain Protestant denominations are called some certain Pentecostal denominations are called, are snake handlers, where they handle poisonous snakes to test faith, going back to certain verses in the Psalms and in the uh, uh, epistles of Paul. But the government of the United States outlaws those. So, in some ways, the political authority is the sovereign community. It's the community of human beings that includes all other communities. Now, um, politics, the word politics comes from the Greek word like mathematics, statistics, politics, the ek ending in Greek, politike, the activity or the study of that thing. So when Aristotle used the word politike, he meant either the politics, the way a sovereign community behaves, and or the science of that. So he used the same term. We've kind of used, we fashioned different terms, politics and political science. And we'll come back to at the end of this discussion, walk through some of the concepts that Wilson discusses. I like some of his definitions and everything, but what I want to do here is sort of suggest my definition. And I have to say that my orientation within political science and political philosophy, that matters, I tend to be an Aristotelian, sort of informed by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton of the American founders, and by the great modern political scientist Tocqueville. So, as you'll see, that means I'm an institutionalist for long, which I'll explain later. So, um, the word politics is the activity of the political community, of the polis. And when I give a formal definition of this, when we study, say, ancient political philosophy, which I'm teaching right now, politics is the activity of the members of the political community to try to structure the common good. Now, the common good, as you're going to see, is very controversial, um, and some people argue that actually it's a ruse, that there's no such thing as the common good. Read Plato's Republic, one of the dialogue participants stands up and shouts at Socrates at one point that there is no common good. It's just the interest of the rulers who wield power over helpless citizens. Well, in some places that may be the case, and to some degree, as we're going to see, the framers certainly thought that rulers try to rule in their own interest. Getting them not to do that may be one of the enduring problems of politics. But in some ways, uh, we turn from the sovereign community and its activity of politics, and we come to what I would call the fundamental unit of analysis in political science, at least from the political science that I practice. And I use a helpful analogy, and that's psychology. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are all kinds of versions of psychology and different ways of approaching the study of the human person. But it might be useful to say that some versions of psychology, like Freudian psychology or Jungian psychology or Aristotelian or Platonic psychology, that we see persons in front of us, the concrete things, and that what makes this person different from that person, and what explains why that person behaves the way that person does, or that person, is the concept of personality. So we understand that every person has a personality. And you could say that in most versions of psychology, not all, the fundamental unit of an analysis, like in chemistry, the fundamental unit of analysis is the atom or the molecule. Um, in and so in psychology, you could say the fundamental unit of an analysis is the personality. And there are different structures and theories of personality. You know, Freud thought that the human personality consisted of three elements: the id, superego, and the ego. Or Jung had other different ways of structuring human consciousness and behavior. But you're going to see that in the political science that I practice, the fundamental unit of analysis is the constitution, or what another synonym of that is the regime. And I'll come back to that and explain that a little bit more. That's on the notes, by the way. That's D. We'll talk about that in a second. So if you understand the analogy, psychologists study the human person with using the structure of analysis of personality. Political scientists study politics, or the polis, the political community, the nation or the country, by looking at its kind of political personality. And as you're going to see, that's what the constitution of a country is. It's that country's political structure of politics or political personality. Um, One way, and I'll find different ways of defining this core concept. Um, and if you look on the notes under D, there are three core synonyms of the same concept: constitution, and I'll talk about the etymology of this term, uh, or regime. We often say the regime of France or the regime of Britain, the regime of the People's Republic of China. Same concept as constitution, and polity is the less familiar, but you can see that goes back to polis, polity, politics, and it was actually the Greek word for constitution. So, what the Constitution is, in a broad definition, is the comprehensive political system of a nation. And every nation has a constitution, by the way, as just as every person has a personality. Um, Yes, some people have personalities that make you not want to sit for 10 minutes next to them on a bus, but that's a different issue. So, and note, by the way, um, every country has every nation has a constitution, but not every nation has a written constitution. A written constitution, in some ways, is a modern novelty. And when we turn to the framing of the American Constitution, we'll see that the American founders, both in the Articles and even prior to the Declaration of Independence, during our colonial times, the idea that you could put the fundamental system of a country in a document, in a written document, in some ways is an American invention. There might be other claimants for the oldest written constitution. Some people consider the Torah or the Hebrew Bible as the written constitution of the Jewish nation in antiquity. But the idea that the constitution of a nation is written is, as we'll see, a particularly American feature. Having said that, and by the way, take for instance Britain. Britain doesn't have a written constitution. Uh, it has, as you'll see, the same elements that every other constitution does, but there's no single document in Britain that summarizes its political system. There are fundamental laws like the Magna Carta or the Reform Act of 1832, and there are critical, obviously governing institutions like Parliament and the Crown and the English judiciary. But again, it doesn't have a written constitution. Again, we'll see what trying to put the politics of a country in a written form, a fundamental written form, how that developed in America. And one would have to say that of all the 200 and say 20 to 30, almost 40 now nations in the United Nations, almost all of them have imitated the American Constitution, as do all the American states, and try to found their politics on a written constitution. We're going to see, by the way, as we go through the founding and examine the construction of the Constitution and its contents very intensively later, that not every aspect of American politics is contained in the written Constitution. For instance, there's no mention in the written Constitution of political parties. Those institutions developed later. Having said that, I think a good analogy of the written Constitution in American political life to the relationship between the Constitution and American political life is very much like a person's DNA. Um, uh, One of the most interesting things to study is the study of identical twins separated at birth. I have a particular interest in that. And uh, and it turns out there's a subset of human beings, and you know that identical twins have identical DNA, and yet, and it's remarkable when identical twins are separated and often don't even know of their own existence, that they nevertheless often lead remarkably identical lives or similar lives, but not identical typically. And and psychologists have concluded, or geneticists have concluded, that perhaps 50 to 60% of our identity is contained in our DNA. But if but not all of our identity. Obviously, you and I are products of the way we were raised, of the environment that we were raised in. And so in some ways, I think that's similar to American politics. The Constitution is the organizing DNA of our politics. It provides the core structure and has guided the development and unfolding of our politics. But again, not all institutions in American life are contained therein. Many have developed subsequent to and around the institutions, like political parties. And there are other institutions like the media or even universities, which have a profound influence on American politics, but are not in the Constitution. Yet, as Wilson says in Chapter 1, the beginning of the understanding of American politics is the founding, um, uh, as we shall see. Let's turn to the notion of the Constitution and get a little bit of fix. The definition I gave was the comprehensive political system of a country. As we'll see, a more specific way of defining that is the Constitution is the ordering or setup of the institutions of a country. And I'll come back to the minute when I define the word constitution and institution. They come from Latin, as you'll see. Now, but before we turn to that, let's look at what the elements of a constitution are. When you say we're going to look at the Constitution of the United States or the Constitution of Britain or of any other nation in the world, ancient or modern, what are the things that you're actually going to be looking in the political life of that country? Again, if I were a Freudian and a psychologist, and I wanted to look at the personality structure of a human being, I would be looking at the id, the conscious entity that decides between moral impulses learned from society and the superego, and the animal impulses, which in some cases are extremely powerful. Um, and that's where personality dynamics. Now, I have to tell you again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of a core Aristotelian. My political science follows Aristotle's political science, which I still think is potent and relevant for describing human political life. Um, but there are four core elements of a constitution, and if you're looking on the notes, you'll see this is indeed. A constitution consists of, first and foremost, a core set of ideas or principles, common beliefs of a nation, beliefs regarding, for instance, the nature of human beings and what justice is as a result of that nature. Now, you're going to see that in the case of America, there's a particular document that states the core beliefs of Americans that make America or Americans, that constitutes what Americans essentially believe in, and that's from the Declaration. You'll see it's from the second paragraph of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So you could say right at the beginning, what makes an American, as opposed to different from, say, a French aristocrat in the 17th century, or from an ancient Roman, or even from the People's Republic, is a belief that human beings are fundamentally equal in decisive respects, and they possess these things called rights. So you could say, well, doesn't everyone believe that? No. I mean, in the French aristocracy or in the aristocratic regimes or constitutions of medieval and post-medieval Europe, there were aristocracies. Aristocracy is a Greek term that means the rule of the best. And aristocracy is a nation and has a constitution that rests on the idea that human beings are fundamentally unequal, that some human beings are superior to others. Again, in the American Constitution, our core understanding is that human beings are equal. Now, by the way, just because citizens in a country share a common set of beliefs doesn't mean that they share the same ideas of those common beliefs. I mean, look at the most fundamental division to occur in our history between slavery and slave states and non-slave states. That's a pretty fundamental difference of belief about what human equality is. And we'll see that that even proceeded so far in the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South, that some Southern thinkers were even denying that the principle of human equality really isn't true, or that certain human beings don't participate in that principle. So even though all Americans believe in some kind of human equality and believe that human beings have rights, there can be tremendous controversies about how those principles play out. To give a quick example, again, take a contentious issue like abortion. It's interesting. I think all political controversies in the United States come down to a difference of opinion about the nature of rights. The pro-life side of this issue sees the fundamental principle as the right to life of the fetus. The pro-choice individuals, those people that hold that opinion, believe in the fundamental right of a woman to choose or have autonomy over her body. What you notice is these often intense combatants nevertheless agree that the issue is the nature of rights. So every constitution has a certain shared set of beliefs that, again, that guide the identity and explain what that political community thinks human beings are and how to achieve justice. Those ideas then find embodiment, or if you want to use it almost a Christian term, also a Hindu term, and because both of those religious traditions believe in incarnation, that divinity is incarnated. And by the way, incarnation means in-meated. Carne is the Latin word for meat. So in other words, that certain ideas or principles, even divinity in those religions, become flesh. An institution, in a general sense, in a constitution, are the structures that actually wield power and that are guided by or are embodiments of the core beliefs. I'll come back to the actual definition in a bit. Now, those institutions, once they are set up, begin to govern. That is to say, they begin to act. They pass laws and policies. And every political constitution has a range of laws and policies that govern the behavior of the nation and the citizens within it. And last, and this is hard for, I think, moderns to grasp because we don't think of this aspect of human life as political. There's a certain way of life that the people in that country share as a result of believing in those ideas, living under those institutions, and being governed by the laws and policies. Um, Again, this is pretty obvious. If you think about it, Americans, not all Americans have the same culture, not all Americans behave identically, but there's a unique American way of life, you could say. I mean, let me give a quick example. When I was taking Russian, I took the Russian, I love languages, I've studied 14 of them, oh boy. Um, I took Russian when I was a freshman, and our Russian professor was actually from Czechoslovakia, but had lived many years in the Soviet Union. And our Russian book said the citizens of Moscow walk around never smiling and never talking. And the Americans in my class, we thought this was funny. And the teacher said, no, they don't. And if you think about it, by the way, the nature of authoritarianism or totalitarianism, people that lived in a regime where you could be punished for anything that you said and did would, of course, learn the habit of not expressing them freely. Americans are known for their rather fond embrace of expressing their opinions and ideas. Americans are a very open people. We like to say what we think because, generally speaking, because of the principle of equality, we believe everyone has a right to an opinion. And because of the freedom embodied in our Constitution and way of life, we generally don't suffer the effects of what we say, unless you're married. That's a different issue. Kidding. But so in some ways, there is an American way of life, American way of dressing, blue jeans, McDonald's. We've imported those to the rest of the country. And if you don't believe that Americans are often quite similar to each other, you need to travel with Americans in other countries. You can often spot an American a mile away, as we like to say, because we're loudmouthed and we often brag about our country. So every political constitution, every constitutional regime has these four core elements: fundamental set of beliefs, a fundamental core guide structure of institutions, policies that govern behavior of the nation and its citizens, and a way of life that flows from them. And by the way, here's an example of that: English, American English. Um, Almost all other languages in the world that come from aristocratic origins have two ways of expressing you. In German, you say Sie, we call it formal and informal. Sie und du. In French, vous and tu. In Spanish, usted and tú. In Russian, oui and tu. Uh, but but in American English, and there was a time in English when we said you and thou, but essentially, aristocratic regimes where you have different classes of human beings by birth found linguistic ways of expressing that. Sie and du in German was originally not just formal and informal, but rather what you would say to a superior, a social or political superior, as opposed to your peer group. So, in some ways, that's an example of how political regimes even shape something like language. Now, let's get to the actual definition of what an institution and a constitution is. The fundamental root that both of those words share is the Latin word stare, to stand. So literally, an institution is something that is stood up, erected, like a house. You have to build institutions and set them up. They have to be created according to design and purpose. Um, and I'll give you a slightly more formal definition in a minute. And a constitution, the prefix con in English comes from the Latin word cum, which means together. So a constitution is what holds the whole thing together. It's like a synthesis, or like a symphony is organized by a whole principle of arrangement. So an institution is something that's erected. We'll talk about what that something is in a minute. And this is my formal definition of what an institution is, and I think it'll be helpful. And so a constitution is an arrangement of institutions and other things. So if you're looking at the notes, what's my definition of an institution? Let me read it. An institution is an arrangement of human beings. Human beings are the stuff that institutions are made of, that channels power. And in the Wilson text, I'm not going to go fully into a definition of power. Wilson gives a nice definition of power as the ability of one human being to get you to do another human being to get that other person to do what you want. And by the way, political scientists and philosophers have struggled for centuries, if not millennia, to define what power is. It's an elusive concept, even though we tend to know when it's being exercised over us, and 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 when we exercise it over others. There's a nice distinction in the in the Wilson book between power and authority, and that's actually a useful definition because, as you're going to see, when you come from a political system that has a written constitution, the governing institutions have to explain or justify their use of power, often by a textual source of their authority. And we often, as Americans, distinguish between an unauthorized act of power and an active power, an authorized act of power. For instance, if you watch the impeachment of President Trump this last year, there was all kinds of debates going on between the presidency and the Congress and the House about whether certain procedures were authorized by the constitutional grant of power to the House, and whether the president's refusal, say, to obey a subpoena issued by a committee in Congress was authorized by the Constitution. The Constitution is relatively short, as I mentioned on Monday's lecture, but as you're going to see, to have lasted so long and to fit the entire length, breadth, and width of the politics of a nation, it turns out that the sparse words of the Constitution are open to profoundly contesting interpretation. So, at any rate, to go back to the definition, an institution is an arrangement of human beings that channels power to perform a social or political function. So, for instance, take your parents. Your parents may belong in an institution, but they actually are an institution too. Um, that is to say, they are created by the laws of the state. Yes, they exist informally, and you could say that even if no state existed, you'd still have the institution of parenthood because there's a natural function there. But think about it. Do parents exercise power over their children? Of course they do. And so, in some ways, the whole point is not, of course, to humiliate their children and make them wash the dishes after dinner, but the whole point of parental power is to actually raise children and to help them become adults and to wash the dishes after dinner. Um, so, in some ways, you could say, I'm an institution, and many people think I belong in an institution, but I'm an institution, I'm a professor. Uh, that is to say, the institution of Converse College, also an institution, an arrangement of human beings. There's a president, there's a provost, there's a faculty, there are cleaning people, there are students. All of us have different levels of power within that institution. And the institution of Converse College channels certain power. I have certain power over you. You have certain power over me when you turn in your student evaluations. I'll tell you how to fill those out later. Kidding. Um, so, in some ways, a professor is an institution. A state like South Carolina is an institution. The First Presbyterian Church of Spartanburg is an institution. They are made up of human beings. There is power that is channeled within them, and that power exists for certain purposes, whether it's to raise children in a family, to educate students in a college or university, or to allow people to drive with open bottles of whiskey and a shotgun in their back seat, as the state of South Carolina. I'm just kidding about that. All right, so in a way, to go back to the idea that a science or a discipline has a fundamental unit of analysis, you could say the fundamental unit of analysis is the institution or the constitution. By analogy to, say, physics and chemistry, the institution is like the atom of political and human life. The molecule is like the larger institutions that are composed of. The Constitution is like the molecule or the system that's composed of institutions. So, uh, what we'll be doing in this course, now go back to the four levels or elements of a regime: ideas, institutions, laws and policies, and culture or way of life. Most people probably expect in a political science course, an American government course, to be studying the two middle ones, institutions and laws. And in fact, in the academic world, we would say, well, principles and ideas belong to the realm of philosophy, culture and way of life belong to sociology or anthropology or something like that. But in reality, this notion of politics is pretty comprehensive. And you're going to see that many of the discussions in this course, when we pick apart the Declaration and get to its core concepts, will feel like a course in philosophy. Now, it's true. We're gonna spend most of this course looking at the formation and development of the American Constitution and its institutions and their developments, and the problems and criticisms that our institutional life has. Nevertheless, you can see that the idea of politics behind this course is a pretty comprehensive one. And we'll be starting out on Friday by taking apart the construction and ideas pretty intensively over the next couple of days of the Declaration of Independence that states the core beliefs of the American regime. The last thing I just want to talk about is I don't want to go through an exhaustive discussion of the elements in chapter one of the Wilson text, but I like some because again it's primarily introductory. We'll be using the subsequent chapters much more intensively, believe me. But I like certain things about this chapter. I like their little definition on pages 2 and 3 of what an issue is. If you're looking at the book, um, each is an issue defined as a conflict, real or apparent, between the interests, ideas, or beliefs of different citizens. That's not bad. You could say that what unites us and divides us on certain things are certain issues. The issue of healthcare, the issues of abortion, the issues of race, the issues of taxation. So yeah, you could say all politics is about issues, the things that people get passionately attached to and interested in and argue about. I like their little definition of politics on page slightly more mm, I don't know, technical or what you call it than my definition on the second column of page 2. Um, um, Whatever form issues take, they are the raw materials of politics. By politics, we mean the activity, negotiating, argument, discussion, application of force, persuasion, etc., by which an issue is agitated or settled. In a way, that's okay, and that's a nice descriptive. It leaves out the notion that what all that agitation and negotiation is a group of people trying to decide what's good for them as a group. Strictly speaking, the more once you have more than one human being, you've got politics. If you saw the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, where he's marooned on an island for 4 years, there are no politics there. Although it was kind of poignant because he was so lonely, he wanted another human being. He turned the soccer ball or volleyball, whatever that was, into a character and gave it a name, Wilson, and he began to relate to it. The Bible says it is not good for man to be alone, and Aristotle says we're political animals. We're born to be with other human beings. So if you just add one more person to your environment, you've got politics. If you've been married, you know what I mean. So politics can entail two people, it can entail 330 million people. It's the activity of that group of people trying to articulate the issues of their lives and come to an agreement about what's good for them as the common good. Does it always produce the common good? No, obviously. One of the interesting things about politics, when you look at the history of politics and the human race going back 7,000 years to the rise of civilization and cities and politics as we know it, really, it's not a pretty story. It's almost like you want to, like, quote, Hamlet. It's a tale told by an idiot. Most of the politics of humanity seem to have been dysfunctional, where a small group of people, aristocrats, totalitarians, kings, and monsters, um, have ruled masses of human beings and exploited them. Um, I'm not going to ask you to approve of American politics, but I will promise you that by the time you're done with this course, you'll understand American politics much better. And again, we already talked about the distinction between power and authority. Power seems to be such a common sense and concrete concept, but it turns out power is an elusive concept, and authority we already talked about. The other things you might want to pay attention in the chapter are I like um, uh, the 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 nice description of on page 5 of the 5 different views of who owns how power is exercised in America, the class view, the powerly view. We're not going to make much of that in this class, but it's an interesting discussion and different kinds of policies in terms of cost and benefits. Uh, like if a benefit is widely distributed in society versus narrow benefits, like farm subsidies versus Social Security. All right, I tell you what, this I went on for 45 minutes not because I couldn't stop, but because we're not doing our Zoom groups. There are 3 sessions of this class a week, 50 minutes each, 150 minutes. I'm going to try eventually when we get our class going to make the proper amount of time, essentially most of it through a video lecture with about 15 minutes of team Zoom time or mini Zoom time and about 5 to 10 minutes of individual attention. So that over the course of a week, you and I will have some kind of FaceTime equaling about 150 minutes. Uh, okay, enjoy the video, and we'll see you tomorrow and on Friday.